Hello, everyone. Hopefully, everyone enjoyed their lunch. As was mentioned earlier, we're going to switch our topic for the one that was scheduled for this time. My name is Felix Chevalier. I live here in Houston, Texas. I have a law practice. You're going to hear a lot of technical information. What I will try to do is to kind of give you a more practical perspective, and even share stories. I'm the son of Cuban parents. I was born and raised in New York. Both of my parents are from Guantanamo, Cuba. I have many Cuba stories. Our firm is now representing companies who are looking to do business in Cuba. So to the extent that I can, I'll share some of that information as well. We're actually going to start our panel discussion with a presentation from, we have two panelists here. We're going to allow them to introduce themselves, and then it'll be kicked off with a presentation con la profesora.
Good afternoon to everyone. It's difficult to take a floor after the lunch. I know. I'm sorry. Thank you again for this invitation. We are very happy to be here with you, sharing our experience. I'm going to talk about some legal aspect about foreign investment in Cuba. We have now a new law in Cuba with new opportunities for all foreign investors, including American investors. Okay, some points about the general background. We have some important dates in the history of foreign investment in Cuba. Of course, in the base of the legal aspects, in 1982, we approved in Cuba, it was approved a decree law on economic association between national entities and foreign entities. Later, in 1992, we were living in Cuba a special period, and it was reformed our constitution. Our constitution, it was approved in 1976, but it was reformed in 1992. In this reform, it was recognized the property of joint ventures, economic associations, and associations that are established in conformity with the law. It was important landmark in the history of the foreign investment in Cuba. In 1995, also we were living the special period, it was approved the first investment law in Cuba, the Law 77. Professor Juan Triana explained very well in the morning the guideline of the economic and social policy. In this guideline, we can find a reference of the importance of the foreign investment for Cuba. In 2013, it was enforced the policy of foreign investment in Cuba with a specific objective, like access to advanced technologies, substitution of imports, diversification and extension of export markets, creation of new sources of employment, and access to the foreign capital. And finally, in 2014, it was approved the law 118 for foreign investment. And we see in Cuba the foreign investment, and it's general in the majority of the country, a source of development, and not only a way to make money. This is very important. Our legal framework, of course, the law of foreign investment, the decree law that regulates the law. This is a difference with the former law, the Law 77. We have now a regulation that has important in order to complement the law, 2 agreements of the Council of Ministers, 2 resolutions of the Ministry of Foreign Trade and Investment, a resolution of the Ministry of Labor and Social Security, and also 2 resolutions of the Cuban Central Bank. So, guarantees for foreign investors. First, the state shall guarantee that the benefit granted to foreign investors and their investment are maintained through the entire period for which they were granted. This is very important. Foreign investment could not be expropriated. This is a huge issue that only in the case of for reasons or public or social interest. In other cases, it's not possible, the expropriation. The state shall guarantee foreign investor the free transfer abroad for dividends or profits in freely convertible currency, free from taxes or any other fees associated to said transfer. The foreign investment shall be protected against legal claims by third parties or the extraterritorial implementation of the state's law. Foreign investment modalities. Modalities means legal entities that are now possible in Cuba according to the new law. First, joint venture is the legal entity that you can open in Cuba in a way most rapidly, in a quickly way. For example, Havana Glue, it's a joint venture, Habanos is a joint venture, Los Portales and Cuban Petrol. All of them are joint ventures. What is the definition? Joint venture is a Cuban trade company which adopts the form of a corporation with registered shares in which one or more national investors and one or more foreign investors participate as shareholders. The second is the International Economic Association Agreement. It's only a legal entity, an agreement between one or more national investors and one or more foreign investors for the realization of activity fitting an international economic association, even without this being a legal entity distinct from that of the parties. There is not here a new legal entity, okay? There is an association of partners. And the third is a totally foreign capital company, trading entity with foreign capital without involvement of any national investor or natural person with foreign capital. This is the legal entity that are now possible according to the new law. Okay, sectors for foreign investment in Cuba, recognized in the policy of foreign investment, recognized in the guideline, and also in the law. Foreign investment may be authorized in all sectors except for the health care services for the Cuban population, excluding their business systems, the education services for the Cuban population, excluding their business systems, the armed force, excluding also their business systems. As you can see, you can invest in almost all sectors of the economy. Employment regime. In this case of the employment regime, we have a resolution of the Ministry of Labor and Social Security, and also it's totally applicable our labor code. We have now a new labor code that it's applicable as supplementary rule in this case. The regulation of the labor regime of the foreign investment in areas such as, this is the case of the resolution, negotiation of the amount to pay for labor force, the elements to take into account consideration for the formation of a salary to be received by the workers and the return of this to the employing entity. Some points important when we are talking about the employment regime. First, the workers shall be, as a rule, Cuban or foreign citizens. In the case of the foreign citizens, permanent residents in Cuba. The Cuban or the foreign staff shall be hired by the employing entity, with one exception, the case of the members of their management board or administration. The employing entity shall negotiate a labor force supply contract with the joint venture or the totally foreign capital company. Payment to Cuba and foreign workers shall be effected in Cuban pesos. Cuban or foreign workers who may be working for the party to International Economic Association Agreement shall be hired by the Cuban investor. As you can see, you have here some important elements about the employment regime. We have in Cuba a special development zone, Mariel. It was created by law, not in the way of construction, by law in 2013. This special zone is located to the west of Havana City, at the distance of 45 kilometers of Havana. The zone has very favorable location and logistic condition, especially after the a great investment made in the Mariel port. The space, which special policy and regimes are applied, has the goal of promoting sustainable economic development by attracting foreign investment, technological innovation, and industrial concentration, with a view to increasing exports, effectively replacing imports, and generating new sources of employment in Cuba, in constant articulation with the domestic economy. It's important to mention that this zone has a special legal regime, different to the general regime for the foreign investment in Cuba. In this case, the legal regime is based on the Decree Law 313. The name of the Decree Law is of the Special Development Zone Mariel, and has, of course, the supplementary rule, the Foreign Investment Act. Okay, this is a picture of, you can see the place was located, the Mariel zone. Okay, activities and sector prioritized in this zone: biotechnology and pharmaceutical industry, renewable energy, agro-food industry. This morning, it was a great presentation about energy in Cuba. It's very important, and this is a sector that we need to prioritize now in the country. Also tourism, canning and packaging industry, agriculture, telecommunications. That is the only sector in which you can invest according to the US measures, Obama measures, and investment in infrastructure. This is the sectors prioritized in this zone. This zone has also a special tax system. It's more flexible, it's more attractive for investors. Okay. Protection of intellectual property. It's an issue very close to the foreign investment in any country in the world, because it's important for investors that they can protect their assets, IP assets, in the country in which they want to invest. In Cuba, we have a Cuban Industrial Property Office that protects all industrial property rights related to trademark, patents, geographical indication, industrial designs. So every American can protect in Cuba the trademark, the geographical indication. In the case of the US, you don't have in your law a geographical indication modality. You have a certification mark, but you can protect in Cuba through the modality of geographical indication. There are several specialized law firms in the country, 5 firms, in fact, where the services of official agents can be requested, associated, of course, to the protection of intellectual property. According of foreign investment law, the rights over the revenue obtained in whichever modality of foreign investment subject to IP protection, intellectual property protection, are regulated by the agreements containing founding documents in compliance with the relevant legislation in force. So, US-Cuba foreign investment, perspective, realities. Professor Juan Triana mentioned some of these aspects this morning. For example, in the case of negotiating business deal in Cuba, people said, and it's true, it's time-consuming, and there are many complexity of the country bureaucracy, it's true. But in my opinion, the second factor is the most important. Cuba is unexplored territory for American companies, American businesses. There are many uncertainties because it's unmapped, uncharted territory for American, for everyone involved. And for example, for French company, they are accustomed to deal with Cuba business, but for America, it's very different. For my point of view, the second factor is the most important, because in many countries, the process for foreign investment is time-consuming and it's also bureaucratic. Some realities. US investors are in the same position in Cuba as the rest of the investors according to the Cuban law. I know that the reality is sometimes different, but according to Cuban law, you are in the same position as the rest of the investors. The example of the Cuban will to allow the participation of US companies is the agreement for the management of 3 hotels in Cuba this year. US, this is something very important, but it's important for Cuban people. US is the leading industrial power in the world. There's no discussion about it. It's highly diversified and technological advanced industry, including telecommunication, chemical, electronic, energy, transportation, food processing, consumer goods. It's something very attractive from Cuban perspective. This morning, someone mentioned that Cuba is a net importer in the case of energy, but for example, in technology in general, we are net importers. For that reason, it's very important for Cuba, the US foreign investment, the American foreign investment. Thank you very much.
Gracias, Profesora Dominguez. As I mentioned at the beginning of this panel discussion, I'm going to try my best to guide this discussion from a practical perspective. And for that reason, we have Paul Madden here. I'll let Paul introduce himself, and then we can get into some of my questions, but I ultimately want to really defer to the audience because I think you guys will have the best questions for the panel. Paul?
All right. My name's Paul Madden. I'm the only small business guy in the room here, probably. And they warned me about that. And I also know there are a lot of lawyers here, so I'm going to be very careful what I say. But, all right. I guess my story starts, actually, I used to sail down to Cuba by boat in the late 80s and made some humanitarian trips to Cuba, went to the film festival. Any excuse that I could have to go there by boat, I did it. And I had been working in the large yacht industry for about 25 years, and so that's where the convergence is. When President Obama made his proclamations in December 2014, I thought there might be something that I could do in Cuba. And I went on the internet and tried to do a little research. I found some lawyers in Washington that had been dealing with the embargo for decades and managed to get through to more than one. And not only did they try to discourage me, they wouldn't take my money. They said, there's no point in applying. You will not be carrying people to Cuba by boat. And there are a lot of ways of looking at it. You can remember the last time we did it was called the Bay of Pigs. The Cubans had just been very wary of arrivals, particularly from Florida, because they're unannounced arrivals from Florida over the years. So anyway, I studied it a bit. I knew that Crowley was taking containers in, and I knew that American Airlines under charter were taking passengers in. And all the language referred to vessels, vessel operators. I cut and paste a few other people's licenses together. I threw it into Treasury, and I forgot about it. And then on July 6th of 2015, I got an OFAC license, and I didn't know what it was. So I just forgot about it for about a week, and then I met an attorney, and he explained that it was possibly significant. And then I found out I had the same license that Carnival had. And they issued 6 on that day. They issued 4 to ferry companies, 1 to Carnival, 1 to myself. The 4 ferry companies, certain members of a certain family in Cuba don't like ferry boats. And they're not going to come in. And every time I've had a government meeting, they've repeated that. And I understand why. It's just not the kind of tourist that is going to be useful to them. So a month later, about 5 weeks later, while we were figuring out how to form a business and actually turn this into a business, we took a charter yacht to Havana from Key West just to try it out. And it was a successful trip, and everything worked according to plan. And as always, the Cubans are very gracious about incoming vessels. And but now there's a layer of obviously you have the Treasury Department and the visa requirements on our side, and then we have Commerce, because a U.S. vessel going to Cuba needs a temporary sojourn from the Commerce Department. And we have also an open license with Commerce to take multiple vessels in for any amount of time. And then there's finally the Coast Guard license, which is mostly a Homeland Security issue. So we went to Cuba. We had some preliminary meetings to explore what we're going to do once we're in Cuba with these vessels and our passengers. And we retreated back to the U.S. And since that time, my company has run more vessels into Cuba from the United States than anybody. We take down various people from corporate CEOs. We've taken State Department people down. We've taken press down, and just families that want to explore the culture of Cuba. And what else can I say? Well, I think I'm just going to say quickly that one thing that we learned early on is we have this broad license where we're allowed to, under the OFAC terms, we're allowed to operate vessels within Cuba. We're allowed to have an office, to have employees. We're allowed to wire funds to Cuba, open a Cuban bank account. And that's all quite wonderful, and we thought that was great until we got to Cuba and tried to do all those things. And we understood that something that everybody needs to understand is that the Cubans, as you've been hearing here, and you're already aware, I'm sure, they have their terms of business. And in fact, whatever visa you decide to declare for yourself in the visa categories, when you get to Cuba, you enter Cuba as a tourist almost always. And that means it's illegal for you to do business in Cuba as a tourist. You're not allowed to have meaningful business relationships or meetings once you're in Cuba. So the whole process of getting a Cuban visa is also quite complicated, because you have to go to Cuba, you have to set up a relationship within a Cuban ministry, and that ministry has to call the embassy in Washington so that you can get in the front door of the embassy and try to get yourself a Cuban visa. So by definition, you have to go to Cuba and do something that's illegal so that you can come back to Washington to get your visa so you can then enter legally. And quick anecdote about that, I had my ministry permissions lined up, and it took me about 2 months to get an actual appointment to come to the embassy in Washington. I did spend about 3 hours outside the gate there one day and realized I was doing it wrong. They wouldn't let me in. So the next time I had gotten all the green lights and arrived at the embassy, the person I was supposed to meet with wasn't there, but I saw him come in a car. I figured that's got to be him. And I did get in, and he was, I think he's number 2. We won't say who he is. And he took me up after I waited for a couple of hours. I went up to a room about as big as this, but with more gilt and gold fixtures. And he asked me what I was doing there, which was odd because how did I get in? But, and I explained I would like to have this business in Cuba, bring yachts in and other vessels. And he said, you can't do that. It's not allowed, can't be done. And started fiddling on his phone, and I said, well, I've already been doing it. And he left the room, made some calls, came back, and we had a meaningful discussion. I did not get my visa. I had to go back 2 more times, and then eventually I got sent across the street to the fellow that actually writes the visas. And somebody from Havana had to be on the phone to tell them that they could give me the visa at that moment. And it's quite, it's a process, but it works. And I guess I just want to finish my introduction by saying I have the OFAC license, I have the Cuban work visa, I have a contract within the Ministry of Tourism, and now we're at a stage where we can, by contracting with that ministry or with the agency that I have a contract with, we can open an office, we can have Wi-Fi, we can have a car, and a Cuban, but it's a subcontractor. It's not an employee. And we've also succeeded, and this is really important for my yacht and vessel owners. We can, if a boat gets incapacitated in Cuba, we can tow it out. Anything from a small boat to we could get an ocean-going tug, and we could take out Carnival Cruise Lines if we needed to. We can move money. We can get emergency repair equipment in the same way that American Airlines can for their aircraft, and we have a fast track at the Commerce Department to get equipment cleared in. And all through this, we've had experienced very good communications, actually from Treasury directly, Commerce directly, Coast Guard has been wonderful. They've actually brought us in after our first trip, and we went over all our charter contracts and all the mechanisms that we use on the maritime side, and they said, it's okay what you're doing. You will go to jail if you do it any other way. And on the Cuban side, we've actually, I think, everybody we're dealing with, we're friends with. And we go out and have meals and have a few laughs, and we get along. And I think that's maybe why we've gotten to a point so quickly. And when I hear that it's 2.5 years to do this and 2 years to do that, we're about just over a year old, and we've seemed to have cracked it. And it isn't until I come to, I think it's been a really long time and really painful, but when I come to meet other people in conferences, I feel very lucky.
Paul, did you have to establish a particular type of business entity when you started doing business in Cuba? And a question for you, Professor Dominguez. You mentioned that there are 3 different types of business entities that the new Cuban regulations have formed. One you mentioned was the International Economic Association Agreement. Is that the one that was used for the Marriott deal?
Yes. Yes, in this case, if you look the different legal entities that are possible according to the new law, in this case, it's this one because you have a partner in Cuba already, okay? For that reason, if you see the definition of International Economic Association Agreement, In this case, there is not a new entity. It's an association between Cuban partner and American partner. It's the case, for example, of the management of the hotels in Cuba, okay? And in this case, it's possible also the totally foreign capital company, but it's more difficult. And you have a Cuban partner. You need a Cuban partner. And if you see a law and the policy and the guideline, tourism is a priority in Cuba. For that reason, if you, my recommendation is that you should present your project, your program, to the ministry.
Yeah, you start with a business plan, just like any place else.
And also contact the Chamber of Commerce in Cuba in order to get more information, in order to present a complete project, a complete program before the ministry. Maybe it's time consuming, maybe, but it's important to present something. This is my Cuban partner, and this is my modality, a legal entity that I want in Cuba.
Paul,
Because you have a specific, you have a specific license. This is an important point, okay?
Yes, the first meetings I had, they said, yeah, you got the OFAC license, you know. Sure. And I slapped it on the table. They said, oh, let's have a look at that. And they took it out of the room, checked it all out, and then they came back with very specific questions, and we got into a lot of details on it. But I got the distinct impression, and I've seen it down there, they're very hospitable and correct and polite and professional, and you will get a meeting. But I don't know if you get a second meeting. You got to show up with the license, and they study the license. And for obvious reasons, there's no point in them doing business with somebody that isn't ever going to get an OFAC license to waste their time. And if they have the wrong OFAC license, or you've interpreted it differently than they do, they don't want to go during this honeymoon period, if I could say that. They don't want to go get into a jam with, you know, have me get in a jam with OFAC because of business that I started with them.
So, Paul, do you have employees that you hire in Cuba, or do you, obviously you're working with Cubans, obviously there has to be an exchange of currency. Do you have, any type of credit facility? Are you operating purely for cash? You made reference to a bank account. Do you use it? Is that an account that you can use from the United States? I mean, I know from personal experience that in the United States, when I've tried to make payments to consultants related to work they've done for me related to Cuba, it's been stopped by various banking institutions. So
yeah,
how are you working through that process?
We have a mechanism set up to move funds into Cuba if we need it, and it's through an account in Europe that is registered and published by Treasury Department as being okay. In general, we use cash. Our big yachts all have big safes on board, and we have euros and we have dollars, and we got plenty of it, and that's what we use. And we haven't had an incident where we had to move any particularly large amount, but yeah, it's a cash economy for us.
The other part of the question was in reference to employees. Do you have any employees? And if so, are you going through the process of paying the Cuban partner or Cuban government, who then in turn would pay the employees? Well,
we have a tentative agreement to open an office either in Hemingway Marina or somewhere in downtown Havana with Havana Tour. It'll be a Havana Tour office. We pay for it. It's one of their employees in it, as I say, with a car and Wi-Fi. We haven't started that. It's early in the season. We may have it going in December, but it's on a standby basis because we can't. I know who we could hire. I know how we can hire people because there is a mechanism in the private sector in Cuba now, but we're not enfranchised to do that until we become a member of the Chamber of Commerce. And you can't become a member of the Chamber of Commerce until you've done 2 or 3 years worth of business and brought in more than $500,000 a year or something like that. There's some formula that we're not there yet.
But that can't be true for United Airlines, Southwest Airlines, or even Marriott for that matter.
Well, I don't know if they have a standalone office. They're managing a hotel that's owned by Cuban government. In the case of, I think American Airlines is going to be the first one that's going to get in there. They got fast track to have an office. I think they're going to have an office or may already have one.
So exceptions do exist.
If you've got big friends, that's what I would say. And because the people that I deal with are dealing with Carnival and American Airlines. We're all in the same office there. So I hear talk around the water cooler.
Professor Dominguez, do you have any idea how long it would take to establish any one of these business entities that you referred to? Just to give you some context, literally here, if you want to start a business, you could do it in 10 minutes.
It takes time.
How much time?
Maybe 1 year, maybe more. Because there is a process of government approval, not in all cases. For example, now the Minister of Tourism has a possibility to approve some business in Cuba. But as a general rule, there is a time to the authorities and analyze the business and take time in Cuba. 1 year, 2 years. For example, in the case of the American Airlines, yes, they have an office in Havana, but the process is ongoing.
But even for someone who, a Cuban national who wants to open up a restaurant, a paladar, how long would it take for them to get approval?
In this case, this is not the law for the private sector in Cuba. In this case, is maybe 3 months, 6 months.
I was just curious.
But this is a very specific issue, the foreign investment, and takes time in Cuba. This is a problem. I thought before that it's time consuming. It's true. We need to improve this in order to, because business is it's like industrial property protection in a country. You cannot wait 10 years. You need to have your trademark, your patents in quickly.
Professor Dominguez, I attended the Energy and Infrastructure Conference in Havana in early September. The conference was largely focused on renewable energy and seeking foreign investments. Much of what you shared was shared during that presentation as well. And one of the questions that came up repeatedly was, how is Cuba going to deal with the banking issue, and more specifically the currency? You have the peso, you have the CUC, the convertible dollar. One basic question would be, if someone's going to make an investment in Cuba, is it going to be based off of the Cuban peso, or is it going to be based off of the convertible dollar?
In the case of the workers, or in the case of between companies, for example?
Both. Los dos.
We have, I explained before that in the case of the employers, you must pay in Cuban pesos. In the case between companies, it's different. We have now, as explained before, the new resolution of the Central Cuban Bank, Cuban Central Bank. We have in Cuba also foreign banks. Maybe I'm not expert in this area, but I imagine that in this case, this is a big business, energy. The rule is the same that in other big business in Cuba, for example, from Spain, from France, that they They do business in Cuba with the system, the Cuban bank system. It's complicated for me to explain this, but I believe that the possibility is open. But there is a big problem with the currency, because when you pay to employers in Cuban pesos, it's a big problem because the value is totally different if you pay in Cook.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? As Professor Triana explained this morning, we need to do something in this area of currency because it's a big problem in Cuba now.
Yeah.
Yeah, we touched on the, just any wire transaction in the Fed system that has the word Cuba on it gets grabbed. And so we've had a lot of money delays where somebody's chartering a yacht or doing, even if it's insurance or whatever, if the word Cuba is anywhere, even if it's down in the little memo in the corner, it gets snagged by one bank, and you go through the whole thing of presenting the OFAC license and talking to them and getting them through it. Then they release it to the next bank, and they leave the Cuba thing on there. So it trips it again. So it just makes it really difficult. And if the funds are going to end up actually in Cuba in some kind of a government account, and as I say, we haven't done that yet, but it works because all these tour operators that are here that essentially are on a parallel track with what we do, they have to pay for all the hotels and all the rental cars and all of that. So there's a huge pipeline that's working.
Yes.
But
yes, I can mention something related to the payment for the American companies in Cuba, relating to the protection of the industrial property. For example, if many American companies are now registered in Cuba, their assets, trademarks, patents, and they can pay. Maybe it's very difficult. I don't know the mechanism, the system, but they pay. Okay? And they register every day many trademarks.
In Cuba.
It happens every day, yes. It is, and it's not something new in Cuba. It's something that in the area of the protection of intellectual property, we register U.S. trademark every day, and you register our trademark here in the U.S. It's a bilateral respect in this area, and you pay in Cuba and we pay here. Maybe it's very difficult. Maybe we need to improve the mechanism, but it's possible.
Sure. I'm sure people in the audience will have questions, so maybe this would be a good time to field some of those questions. Who would like to go first? Yes, ma'am.
For how long the Cuban country is going to keep doing the micromanagement if they want to grow into the business? Because, in this case, it was just one person. But I see a room full of ideas and full of vision. So is the Cuban prepared to go one by one by one?
We prefer the business as group. I know that now the situation, for example, in the case of Paul, but you have your company. You are not alone.
yeah.
We are now preparing of macromanagement. It's something that we need to face in the coming years, okay? Because many things are new for us in Cuba.
I see the room.
Yes.
Just think about the entire United States and some other countries.
And big companies.
So you cannot deal with just one person at a time. Just a moment. Let me go and make a phone call.
I totally agree. We need to, of course, and the big companies, for example, he represents his company, but sometimes in Cuba you can see a person interested in something, but we need to deal with big companies also. Maybe a small company is not only one person, okay? And now is a moment to learn.
Professor Peñón?
Alina, just clarification. In one of your early slides, you said that Cuba allows 100% foreign-owned company to operate in Cuba. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
In another statement, you said somewhere that we needed a Cuban partner. So my question is, can in Cuba be established 100% foreign-owned business without a Cuban partner?
Yes, it's possible.
Okay.
Without, it's one of the legal entities that you can open in Cuba. Totally no foreign, no Cuban partner. And we have in Cuba this kind of company now.
Sasha?
This is actually a question maybe for the political panel later, but Paul, I'm curious. There's really two issues here. Number one, the embargo being lifted, so you don't need the OFAC license. But then the second is the government bureaucracy you have to go through in order to do business anyway. It sounds like from your experience, what happens is once you start doing business in Cuba, you develop relationships, it makes the system easier, but the biggest trick is to overcome what is now the embargo. So assume that disappears as of this second.
It disappeared, the embargo.
It's gone, right? Let's just assume at this second it's gone. And anyone can come to Cuba and anyone can do business. You've got Raul Castro, who's in power. He's going to step down in 2018. You've got a successor that's already been named, that's been in the Cuban government for a while. So it doesn't sound like the government structure as it exists is going to disappear anytime soon. But you want to invite investment into the country and you want to make it easier to do business. So what do you think, how do you do that? Do you do it through personal relationships? Do you think the government's going to change? What do you think is going to happen?
Your question is, this scenario is different in the future? Or
Just assume that the embargo is gone, so that's no longer an obstacle. So now I just want to do business with everything being status quo except the embargo is gone.
as explained before, American investor can invest now, according to the Cuban law. The obstacle, the main obstacle today for you is the blockade, okay? You, for example, you can invest in telecommunication. It's the only sector that are open. My opinion is that if the blockade is not sit anymore, it will be very good for Cuban and American because the main obstacle has no in a place. So my opinion is that you can invest now, and if the blockade is not present, the embargo, you can invest more with more facilities, because today, for example, Paul need a non-specific license, need a process, and also from the Cuban perspective, it's where it's difficult, it's rare to deal with American investors right now. It's something new for us, but because of the blockade, because of the embargo. But tomorrow, when the blockade is over, it will be very easy, or more easy. Because if you can invest today, according to the Cuban law, according to the Cuban policy, tomorrow, it's possible that is, I don't know if you are questioning it has a political basement, because you mentioned something about the government, the change of the government. Because of the legal perspective, my opinion is that the scenario without blockade, it will be very good for American investors and for Cuban companies, Cuban entities.
I'd like to,
Can I just add a little something? For you, Paul, you've got the license.
yeah, I'm not worried about the embargo. I'm not looking over my shoulder when I'm in Cuba to get arrested when I return, although it could happen. But let's say, and I have the Cuban interface now with an agency, a very powerful agency in the tourism division, and they opened doors and come to meetings with me to get me pretty far up the food chain where I wouldn't get otherwise. And part of my license and part of what we're trying to do down there is get involved in the maritime infrastructure. So it's ports and it's possibly marine tourism. So that could include not just a marina but also a hotel and service facilities for vessels, because our vessels are very big and sophisticated and need a lot of service. So. For instance, we were invited, almost commanded to come to the FIT convention, the tourism convention, several months ago. And in the opening remarks by the Minister of Tourism, he said, "This is what the government wants to happen," and he listed the things, and he had yachts there, and he actually mentioned our company, and there were a lot of different agencies, government agencies in the room. So it was sort of like, I looked around, I'm the only yacht guy here. All these, this is nice. And I, with some of my associates, we set up meetings as quickly as we could get around town. And there is an RFP out in the marine tourism sector that is calling to rebuild basically all the marinas in Cuba. And we said, that's for us. And we took meetings, and we said, we can fund this, and we'd like to partner it, and we'd like to take this to the next level. And they said, you have to do a business plan, and boom, we had a business plan because we're involved in some of that industry. So, but it got very complicated because it's not just the agency that runs all the marinas. Now it's also the Cuban government foreign investment agency, and they have to talk to each other and decide that they want to move together, and then there are other interests lurking, and we thought we were making great progress, and I can't remember that, but the foreign investment industry that has a beautiful office, and we were in there in the middle of a meeting, getting through this with two very bright people that were the negotiators, I suppose, and the meeting got interrupted, and we were asked to leave the building. And I'm with my Cuban counterparts, so it wasn't just throw the Yankee out. They got thrown out with me. And we got in the car and said, what's going on? Well, they were not allowed to have a meeting with us if the minister was not in the building. And they discovered the minister wasn't in the building. And so the meeting stopped. That's odd. I mean, I can kind of understand, but it's just the kinds of things that you have to learn and roll with, I think, because it's new for the Cubans also to be run at so aggressively by American business interests, and we tend to come in a little heavy.
I think a little context is also important. So I've been to Cuba 3 times this year already. I'll be back there in December, and the one thing that seems pretty obvious to me is that the Cubans seem to be focused on large businesses. Name brand, right? So AT&T, Coca-Cola, United Airlines, Southwest Airlines, which makes sense, right? They're trying to develop the infrastructure of their country, and so it's more efficient to spend their time with big companies that can have a bigger impact, as opposed to dealing with a lot of small companies. So I think to a degree, Paul's example could be really an anomaly because, one, he got in really early, right? And he's doing something a lot of people don't do, right? I mean, operating, yachts. So the Cuban government is really focused on big companies, and they seem to be more comfortable with well-known companies, which is something that we can relate to here in the United States, particularly for those of you who own small businesses. There's, I guess, a risk management factor that goes into that major companies take into account when they're going to do business with someone else. So I think we got to keep that in mind. One of the reasons we also keep hearing this idea, Professor Trina kept emphasizing, to be patient, is because they have a different structure, right? And in their structure, the decisions are made at the top, not necessarily at the lower level. So things have to get pushed up to each level so you can ultimately figure out whether the Cuban government is going to say yes or no to whatever is being proposed. We're not accustomed to that in the United States because people in lower levels of management tend to have a little bit more authority to make decisions one way or the other. There's pros and cons to each. You can debate that all you want, but that's just the reality which necessitates people to be more patient. Yes, ma'am.
So with the statement you just made, would you say it's more favorable for a small business to have a Cuban partner to get their business started in Cuba?
The short answer to your question, I would say yes. The short version, yes. For many, many reasons.
How do you find one?
The question was, how do you find a small business in Cuba to do business with them?
But this is true if you see the different legal entities, the joint venture and the economic agreement require the Cuban partner, but it's possible to have in Cuba a foreign business with foreign capital totally without Cuban partner. It's possible. And there are in Cuba this kind of business now, okay? It depends on the sector because we, as I explained, we see the foreign investment as source of development. In some specific sectors, we require that the Cuban participation in order to develop our human resources, our country. But in other sectors, it's possible to open a totally foreign company without Cuban partner. Maybe in the future it will be different, but now it's the rule according to the law.
In Cuba, legal firms that would facilitate and someone can hire. I'm not talking about a Cuban partner, and I'm not talking about an agent. But I'm talking about if an American company wants to do business in Cuba, can they contract with a bufete privado?
Yes.
To be their legal representative, not necessarily an agent, because we were talking about some issues. There is a little bit of an issue with an agent versus when you hire a legal firm to help you process.
We have in Cuba legal firms
Right.
that they represent the interests. For example, in the case of, as I mentioned, industrial property, we have some firms specialized in this area. But you can find in Cuba other legal firms specialized in do business in Cuba and to do business in Cuba. Okay? And you can contact at any time these lawyers in order to get information, in order to know the procedures, the legal regime according to your interests.
Gentleman in the tan suit had a question.
So is that the advisable course of action to reach out to one of the legal entities to be advised as to how to proceed within the government to get the permission? That was really the question I was going to. You get there in Cuba, you have an idea what you want. Do you go to the Cuban Chamber of Commerce? Will they guide you as to where you have to go? It seems like you have to do a lot of legwork before you get there. And so the question is, let's say you're a little clueless, so the real recommendation is to get one of these lawyers, legal?
My recommendation is contact the legal firm, but also the Chamber of Commerce and the ministry. But the first step is to is contact this kind of legal firms in order to know the legal framework in Cuba. For example, in the case of Paul, it's clear that there are requirements that Paul fulfill completely. Okay? Tourism is a priority. He has a specific license. So why? What happened? For that reason, it's important to know the legal framework. Also, the legal contact in Cuba and the Chamber of Commerce in order to know the steps.
Now, does tourism include, like, you want to set up a recording studio or something like that? Is that part of tourism? The music.
Oh, the music. Okay,
Part of tourism, or is that?
No. I know your point. This morning you mentioned something about entertainment. We have with many countries a cultural interchange, and many musical groups are visiting Cuba every day, as Professor mentioned this morning. But entertainment is not a sector that we want now to give a priority in Cuba. But my job, it's industrial property and copyright also. And we now are working in Cuba in a new copyright policy that, and this policy is very related to the cultural business, because it's important to protect copyright. So I believe that in the future, maybe we can explore the entertainment industry, because it's very important for many countries. For example, many African countries have a strong industrial entertainment industry. In Africa, it's very common. But first, we need to modify our copyright law, our cultural policy, and maybe later the entertainment industry will be open to the foreign investment. No, now.
Having spoken to you briefly, tú hablas español, and you have a history and your family's legendary, I would go in myself if I was you.
Well, I intend to, but it's
yeah.
like, even though I speak the language and I have some family there, I still don't really have a good sense of the road.
I was always warned, be careful who you walk in the door with.
I'll walk in with you.
No, not me. That's a different, that's not my turf. But I don't know if the Cubans, if you will comment on that, but it's the same any place. If you were in Moscow, if you were wherever, somebody says, I know so-and-so and I'm going to take you in. You got to be sure before you go in that door, because that's your first impression. And you may not get in again if you walk in with the wrong person.
I think what Paul, because there was a discussion at lunch that we didn't bring up, and I think the issue is the FCPA. And the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act.
Oh, that too.
It's not
Yeah.
an issue with Cuba, it's an
Yeah.
issue with the U.S. law. And that's why an agent versus a legal firm protects you and gives you some sense of confidence as far as FCPA rules in the U.S. and also. And that is something that at least U.S. companies are very aware of and very careful with. And when we use the name agent, sometimes that relationship has to be managed vis-a-vis the FCPA. So, right, by hiring a legal firm in Cuba, then at least you have some sort of a veil that can manage that relationship.
But you're talking about two different things. You're talking about an agent and a lawyer who may not be the same thing.
Correct.
And the question I think that was being asked is, the question I asked earlier, as an agent is the right person to walk in and ask for whatever kind of business you're trying to develop. How do you find that person when you don't know anything about the country?
Do you mean agent, lawyer, or different? Because in Cuba, we call agent, for example, in the case of registration of industrial property modality, for us, this is agents. But in the case of the legal firms, they are lawyers.
Yeah,
No agent.
two different things, right?
Yes.
I understand getting legal advice from a Cuban lawyer.
Okay.
I understand the importance of that. But I'm talking about Paul's point, which is if you're going to go into a business meeting, you want to make sure, like you would in any place, that you have somebody who understands the right paths to take, the right people to meet, the right permits to ask for. And how do you know who that person is? How do you find that person without?
So,
We
Here's the question I'm asking Paul.
don't have this kind of agents. In Cuba, you need to contact the legal firms and also the official entities, okay, the ministries and also the Chamber of Commerce. And they provide the American and any investors the steps in order to invest in Cuba. This is the way. No, we don't have this kind of agent that you mentioned. For us, agent, it's related to the registration of industrial. It's something totally different.
I think
Okay.
we're interchanging the words and using them in different ways. So a lawyer is an agent, right? A lawyer is an agent. So the young lady here is the first person asked a question, and she asked a question, do you have to go in with a partner? And even a partner is an agent to a degree, right? And so we gotta be careful about the words that we're using, particularly when we're dealing with two different cultures, because you have different interpretations, right? And so, Sasha, to answer your question, just like any other place, you just have to do your homework, right? You have to go in and figure out, you just go in and you get the lay of the land. You may have to go a few times just to figure out who are the players, who's not the player, who do you not want to be around, right? Maybe it is that you go in and get a lawyer. A local Cuban lawyer who understands whatever industry it is you're looking to get in, let's say it's entertainment. Or maybe somebody in the US who has relationships in Cuba, or firms in the United States that have relationships with the Cuban government and Cuban officials who can help guide you through the process. I mean, it is true who brings you through the door can be helpful, or sometimes it can even be detrimental. That's even true here in the United States. And so let's not remove our common sense when we go to another country. Other questions?
So going back to the legal infrastructure and the legal framework that's necessary for the investment, which would be a great context to give. What do you see once the blockade ends, the necessary legal pieces of legal framework that might be necessary to further facilitate, in addition to the Foreign Investment Act of 2014, customs clearance, bank accounts, exporting currency and profit out of the country, hiring people, owning land, leasing land, what are the pieces that, if I wanted to open a McDonald's, and as a business owner, I would want to know, can I buy land? Can I build? Can I import materials? Can I export my revenue? Do you feel there's enough in place already? I know Europeans have been investing for a long time, Canadians have been investing. I mean, what more do you think is necessary?
I believe that any legislation is according to the moment, according to the political and economic situation. Today, our law, this law, is according to the Cuban momentum. Okay, it's a law. It was approved in 2014. In June, the blockade. It's now a reality in Cuba. I believe that this law, for example, if you see, you mentioned before the sectors that are open. We are now looking the investment in big companies, in big business, energy, tourism, food processing, but we want to deal with big companies now because of the blockade. But tomorrow, maybe this legal framework, it will be not enough, okay? Because the condition in the future, if the blockade ends, it will be different, and we maybe need to do something new in our legal framework. In order, for example, to give permission to and a possibility to open in Cuba a small business. You have in this country many small businesses, in Canada also, in many countries, and maybe tomorrow our legal framework will be different. Because in any country, the legal framework is according to the reality, according to the political situation, according to the economic situation. And I believe that tomorrow it will be different. But today, we know that this happens. Sometimes it's very difficult to open a business, an American business in Cuba, but according to this legal framework, it's possible because American investor has in the same position than the rest of the investors. But the blockade is an obstacle, a real obstacle. If Paul knocked a door in Cuba, the people that he met in Cuba think he is American investor. French investor is seen in different way because the blockade is a reality now in Cuba. In spite of the Obama measures, and maybe tomorrow it will be different, and American investors can influence more in the future. But now, with the blockade, it's very difficult because it's a main obstacle for Cuba.
Having said that, I think there's something interesting there, because if a French company goes in and wants to invest tens of millions of dollars and build a hotel or whatever, I mean, we've seen what happened to Credit Agricole. We see what happens when the OFAC slaps them down. It is brutal. And so it seems to me that the opportunity for Americans is to go in with an OFAC license and do it out in the open. And then if you bring in tens of millions of dollars and do an investment, it's out in the open. You're not going to end up in the news for investing in Cuba if you do it the right way. So I think that creates possibly a clear opening for American companies versus the Europeans that we are competing for the same projects right now.
I wanted to ask you, could you tell us a little bit about how are laws made in Cuba? Like, who decides if you want to change a law for the next context or different context? Who does that? What's your internal process?
The internal process of a legal maker.
Of laws. Yeah, how does it work for Cuba?
In Cuba, the laws are approved by the General National Assembly, okay? And the State Council participate also in the process. But like in many other countries, in the majority of the countries, in the process of participate the technical people with technical background. Because if, for example, in the law of foreign investment, of course, in the process of lawmaking, participate the Ministry of Foreign Investment in Cuba, the Trade and Foreign Investment, but also people with technical and academic background. But the process of approval of the law, it's in the hand of the National Assembly. There are other regulations. For example, I mentioned a resolution of the Ministry of health, for example. In this case, the resolution, the process is totally different. It's in the ministry, because the resolution is another level. It's not a law. A law is in the high. Constitution, law, decree law, and resolution. This is the different way of legal instrument. For example, we mention very often the guideline. The guideline of the revolution. This is not a legal instrument. In Cuba, legal instrument is constitution, law, decree law, and resolutions. And the process of approval is different. But in the case of law, it's with the participation of court in the exercise of lawmaking of people with expertise, with technical background. For example, if the U.S. changed the patent law, here participate the people that know about patents. In Cuba, it's the same. But the approval requires some steps.
Going back to Yulia's question about what are some of the infrastructure modifications that need to take place in Cuba, I can just highlight two that seem to be glaring. So one is banking. We talked about what currency you're going to use if you're going to have foreign investments. Literally, when we were at the Energy and Infrastructure Conference back in September, Steve Harris was with me at that conference. There was a point when someone asked a question about, well, what currency are you going to use? And a gentleman stood up and literally in the same sentence, he referenced the Cuban peso and the cuca at the same time. Well, for Americans, that's a 13% variation. And that could make or break a deal, right? So just having a clear understanding of what currency the Cubans are going to operate from, that's number one. Another example is how they're dealing with the employee issue. On the previous panel, there was discussion, or someone raised how India had to import their employees to finish a project. Well, that project is a hotel. Cubans were originally the ones constructing the hotel, but it's over budget and it's past the time it was supposed to be constructed. And so India sent in their employees. The problem that's creating is that the Indian employees are getting paid what they would normally be paid in India, and then you see such a wide discrepancy in the compensation between the Indians and the Cuban nationals, right? Which naturally is going to cause some friction. And so, but that goes back to the currency issue. And not only the currency issue, but how are you going to deal with the employee issue? Because if you can't properly, at least from an American standpoint, incentivize employees to perform on time, then you're going to get the result that they received. I was reading an article about this very issue, and a Cuban worker on the project says something to the effect of, the Cuban government pretends to pay us, and we pretend to work. Well, they got it from the Russians, right? Right. So those are some of the things that are inherent problems that the Cuban government has to wrestle with. And the other thing is just from an infrastructure standpoint, right? As they're looking to attract more foreign investment, if they want foreign investment to come in faster and develop the infrastructure at a faster pace, well, then it seems as if they're going to have to allow lower level management in the Cuban state government to make more decisions. But that means they have to be okay with the fact that people are going to make bad decisions in the process. And I think that's where the struggle comes. We'll take one more question. Yes, sir.
Good afternoon. My name is Marshall, and I'm in the private security industry, boots to the ground, private security. And so my question was related to when American companies go in to build infrastructure, hotels, things of that nature, yachts, does the Cuban government allow foreign security firms to come in and protect these properties, the infrastructure projects and so on and so forth, or is that directly related to the government sector versus the private sector or third-party entities?
Okay, it's something that, for example, in the case of the American airline, they asked to Cuba to participate their security team in the flight to Cuba, something like that. I believe if you mentioned that, for example, if you have an infrastructure in Cuba, if you want to have your security team in Cuba, this is another way of investment, another way of business, because it's different security and the administration of the construction of a building, for example. Okay? In this case, you need 2 permissions. One of them for the business, the main business, that is, for example, the administration of the building or the construction of the infrastructure, okay? And another one for the security purposes. Is totally different. I believe that it will be possible in the future. Now we don't have the case in Cuba. We don't know. In the case of the American airline, it was authorized by Cuba. Okay? I don't know in the future the new business, but at least we have a good precedent now. Okay? Thank you.
Just one thing about security in general for like our business. The marinas are totally secure. Nobody, if somebody even walks up to a yacht, somebody will come out from somewhere and they'll be intercepted. They won't get to the yacht. And our larger yachts arrive with their own security on board. But you have a private security firm, correct? You know, surely Vin Diesel and all the people that were down there for Fast and Furious, there has to have been a full security team with them, and we have somebody here that knows that. And the same with the Rolling Stones. They had 250 people on the ground that were there for that. So there's a mechanism. I don't know exactly what it is, but it happens.
And they do. We just came back from Cuba with the mayor and the Great Eastern Partnership. The mayor had his own security detail with him. That was just a month ago. So it is allowed, but just got to figure out to what extent it is needed and how it will be facilitated. Thank you all.